This was history after all, the completion of the first domestic treble in English football. And yet something else felt more significant, that even an FA Cup final with all its supposed magical imponderables could fall so utterly under the dominance of Pep Guardiola's team. It was not a cup final in any aspect but the name, barely a moment of it ever imbued with uncertainty or risk as far as City were concerned. Rather, it was just like any routine home win at the Etihad Stadium over the course of this season. One in which the away team dig in valiantly, do their best to execute a sensible plan of containment while accepting that this is only really a way of delaying the inevitable outcome. The scoreline equaled the record for the biggest margin of victory in an FA Cup final that has stood since 1903, when Edward VII was on the throne. The Wright brothers first got a plane in the sky and Bury beat Derby County by the same score at the old Crystal Palace Stadium. City's win felt like a walkover from another century, a schoolboy thrashing, the polar opposite of a cup shock. This was the 51st domestic fixture or cup tie for City, and of those they have lost just 4, the last at St James Park on Jan 29. They have scored 26 goals in the FA Cup alone, the most by any team since 1946. Watford were never the lead candidates to beat them in an FA Cup final, although you might have been able to kid yourself as the hopeful crowds thronged Wembley Way that such an outcome was not implausible. Then the game started and it was evident that the difference in what both teams was capable of doing, even on a day like this, was simply enormous. Perhaps the idea of this City team, a side so hard to disrupt, has loomed too large the minds of their opponents this season that the notion of beating them is simply overwhelming. Javi Gracia looked a little shocked afterwards, composed and dignified in his response, but shocked nonetheless. In Copenhagen, readying himself for a concert that was impossible to cancel, Elton John will have been grateful for the small mercy of his own unavailability. There was very nearly a hat-trick for Raheem Sterling, which would have been the first in an FA Cup final since Stan Mortensen scored 3 for Blackpool in 1953, before eventually the FA decided that City's second goal should be credited to Gabriel Jesus. Yet even Guardiola admitted that this had been a long way from Sterling's best performance of the season, in the first half at least, but after that it was all a bit of a blur for Watford. In the end, the jaw-dropping one-sidedness of this match stood as a monument for the season in which, in English domestic football at least, City were unstoppable. For a while at least Watford had done everything right, or at least everything one can expect to do right when your possession count is down to 27% and you are trying to stop the great thrashing machine of English football. And then it really started to go wrong. For the first 35 minutes, Grace's team stayed in the classic edge of the area low block that just about engaged City when they got into shooting range. Mostly they showed Guardiola's side down the right wing where Riyad Mahrez had a lot more of the ball than his counterpart on the left, Sterling, and was well controlled by Jose Holbers, with the help of Roberto Pera. Might it have been different if Pera had taken Watford's best chance on 14 minutes? Gracia said something about it in passing later, although it felt a little wishful. Their Watford coach's point was that you really have to take your chances in those moments to have any hope at all. Abdoulaye Doucouré sprung the trap on 14 minutes and Pera had just innocent a beat. But the man who is arguably the Premier League's best goalkeeper came out at speed and seized the initiative from the Watford attacker whose shot hit Ederson's legs. Guardiola said later that his team were short on energy, although both their first 2 goals involved the rapid turnover of possession followed by the counter-attack. Just before then, Doucouré had an appeal for a handball against Vincent Kompany that referee Kevin Friend waved away. The ball did strike Kompany's right hand, and the slow motion did suggest that it was in an unnatural position, but it was hard to argue it was deliberate. Then came the first goal, the ball originally lost in midfield by Doucouré, who showed too much of it to the tenacious Bernardo. It went to the back post, was half cleared and came back via the head of Sterling. In the moment that it dropped to David Silva, he seemed to push Keiko Femenia in the back before hitting his shot beyond Huel Hogams. Even at that point all was not lost for Watford, but they seemed to shrink, and the domination of the ball by City in the next 15 minutes must have felt overwhelming. Gums made a mistake in coming for Bernardo's back post ball with 7 minutes of the first half to play. Graça would later stand by his decision to select the Brazilian in his last game for the club rather than the first choice Ben Foster. He deserved to play, Graça said. Jesus' shot had crossed the line, it was later determined, before Sterling made sure of it. Kevin De Bruyne came on for a disconsolate Mahrez before the hour, and from then on it became a humiliation for Watford. The Belgian scored the third when Sterling and Jesus combined, De Bruyne sitting Gums down before going past him and finishing. De Bruyne created a second for Jesus on 68 minutes and the floodgates opened. Sterling plundered 2 more in the last 10 minutes as Watford cracked. 5 of the last 6 domestic trophies over the last 2 seasons have been won by Guardiola's team now, a momentum that will be hard for anyone to stop. Against a team that has to attack, City are lethal, and what was left of Watford's confidence had drained away by the end. It was painful for Graça's team, overawed and overwhelmed by a much more powerful opponent, much like the rest of English football this season.